What's that?
Maybe dogs are just smarter than us, and I think that all the stuff that we do.
Yeah, maybe dogs are like a superior beings to us. They're a higher power. Or maybe we're dyslexic. What we mean there is gods, not dogs. So, as much as it pains me to stop talking about my dog for just a moment, let's talk about John Locke for an hour and 15 minutes. Trying to take a slightly different organizational approach this time. I'll kind of put all the stuff on the board here just so that I can kind of keep track of where I'm going and have some sense of how the time is being spent. In addition to that, I suspect that we're going to want to jump ahead in the discussion a lot, so this will kind of help me kind of point over and be like, yeah, we'll get to it eventually. But let's not hop like bunnies, because we're taking a careful route through this material. All right. John Locke's second treatise on government. We did chapters 1 through 5, kind of. We did chapters 1 through 2 for sure. We rushed through 3, 4, 5. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on 3 and 4. We are going to spend a little more time on 5. We'll hang out here for a little while, first half of the class, try to make sense of 3, 4, and 5 in this life, liberty, and property triad. It's fairly important for Locke. In fact, I would say maybe one of the kind of crucial clusters of concepts. But let's start back at the beginning. State of nature. What is the state of nature for Locke? The state? All right, is it the natural state? Is that their nickname? I think there is a state that's like the natural state. That's their slogan, but I don't think it's Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma is okay. I'm serious about that. Now, what is the state of nature for Locke? And it's not Oklahoma because there was no Oklahoma in 1689. What's that? It's still bad. Or at least not as good. I was actually, I'll say this to the camera because I was tracking the discussion board for the online class. And there are some folks that are saying, John Locke thinks that the state of nature is just fine. Thomas Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is awful. And whoa. It's still bad, right? Or it's not as good as civil government in most cases, right? That's going to be one of the big differences between Locke and Hobbes is that Locke seems to be under the impression that it is totally cool in some circumstances. Not just cool, legitimate. That's maybe a more precise word. It is totally legitimate in some circumstances for a group of people to throw off their government. And Hobbes is like, that's not a thing. That gets addressed under the rights and privileges of the sovereign. You cannot do that, at least not without the sovereign's permission. Maybe that's the kind of thing that happens in the Glorious Revolution. Maybe not. I think that's stretching it to say that the king willfully abdicated in that case. Yeah, Pearson? Unless the king immediately, in the process of leaving, prescribes who their successor is going to be. In which case, the sovereign authority never disappears, right? It gets passed. And there would have to be provisions in the original social contract there for Hobbes that say that the sovereign is allowed to do that. But that seems a reasonable enough thing to do. Even if it's not specified as something that the sovereign's allowed to do, we might suppose that that this is just part of sovereign authority. They get to decide if there's another sovereign. But for Locke, the people can decide, which is a little bit different. We're jumping ahead. That's over here, and that's over here. Let's start over here. State of nature for Locke. For Hobbes, we can define this as this war of all against all, right? State of nature is a war of all against all. Perhaps we define it that way. It certainly seems to be something that Hobbes is emphasizing. He identifies the state of nature with a state of war. Not so much for Locke, though, right? Locke seems to think that you can be in a state of nature without being in a state of war. And he also speaks in some instances about being in a state of war without being in a state of nature. Although I'm not that one's a little trickier. What then, if it's not a state of war, What is the state of nature then, as far as Locke is concerned? Yeah, Adam.
A state where no one has authority.
Right, yeah, there is no external authority, right? So, state of nature for Locke is a state where there is no external authority. And I don't mean external like external to the state. I mean external to you, right? Everybody gets to be their own authority in the state of nature. So there's no external authority. Nobody that you can bring your grievances to that will settle those grievances. And when we say there's no external authority, as I just said, everybody is their own authority in the state of nature. We have a kind of an unlimited liberty, unlimited asterisk liberty. And we have the same sort of limitations that Hobbes talked about, but some additional ones as well. Those additional limitations, so the initial ones that Hobbes said, where there are some limitations that are governed by like what you can actually accomplish. We can say that you have unlimited liberty to try at least, but not to succeed at what you're trying to do. Locke identifies some other limitations on your supposedly unlimited asterisk liberty in the state of nature. Those are the laws of nature. So yeah, how would we say this? Unlimited liberty, but it is limited. In fact, yeah, let's stick with that word limited. Limited by laws of nature. And the big kicker for Locke, and this is maybe just kind of continuing to articulate what we mean by saying that each person's autonomy is limited by the laws of nature, and they're their own authority, which means that each has a right. And Locke introduces this term right when he's talking about political power. He doesn't mention it many other times. He doesn't really hammer on this language of rights. But all the conceptual apparatus is there for us to start talking about a theory of rights here with Locke. So, for example, life, liberty, and property, we can talk about these as rights without doing a whole lot of violence to the sort of thing that Locke is talking about. So each has a right to enforce the laws of nature. And those laws of nature are, don't harm yourself. Let's try a different color here because it's getting messy. Don't harm yourself or others. Indeed, bless you. With respect to life, liberty, and property. Which is to say that everybody seems to have a right to life, liberty, and property, such that if anybody tries to infringe upon your life, liberty, or property, in the state of nature even, you have the authority to enforce those laws, to say, no, that's not allowed. And it's not just arbitrary. It's not just going to be a fight to see who wins, who has the most power. There may very well be a fight to see who wins, and who wins is going to be probably determined by who has the more power. But somebody's going to have right on their side. Somebody's going to be entitled and somebody else is not going to be in those cases. So don't harm yourself or others with respect to life, liberty, and property, and each of us can enforce those laws in the state of nature. For yourself or for others as well. If you see somebody else getting their life, liberty, or property messed with, you can step in and say, like, hey, that's not cool. And you also will be on the side of right. You will have this political right in the state of nature to enforce those laws of nature. Big difference so far, right? Because for Hobbes, those 19 laws of nature, Hobbes has more laws of nature, so apparently he's like more into laws of nature. I don't know about that. Those laws are the sorts of things that are laws of reason, which they are for Locke as well, but it seems for Hobbes that they drive us out of the state of nature. They compel us to make the social contract, construct the sovereign leviathan, and enter into civil society, and only then are those laws enforceable. But for Locke, they're enforceable in the state of nature as well. Big difference there, and this is one of the cruxes of this reflection draft for this week. How are we doing so far? Good? Okay. Civil society, then, which is not the state of nature. Civil society is what? And we'll get to it eventually. We'll talk more about civil society. But just to have some sense of where we're going, What's going on in civil society? How shall we define it? I'll give you a hint. It's going to be somewhat similar to the way that we define the state of nature. Obviously not exactly the same because they're different. There is external authority. Right, yeah. There is external authority. And this is the sort of thing that Hobbes seems to be talking about as well, but Locke kind of defines these two in terms of whether or not an external authority exists. There is a political power to enforce laws that everybody has in the state of nature, and that political authority gets relinquished. Each of us relinquishes political authority. Good, that was me. And given over to the public. Or if we want to put this in Hobbesian language, to some sort of sovereign authority, right? So not a whole lot of difference right here, but hopefully we already have some sense that there are a couple of details here, talk of right in the state of nature, talk of laws of nature that are enforceable in the state of nature by anybody. These are going to make all the difference in the world for Locke. Questions here? Yeah, Corbin.
So, do you always bang your marker down on the table when you're switching gears?
Do I always bang my marker on the table when I'm switching gears? Moving on to life, liberty, and property. I don't know, probably not always, but frequently. I guess it's a tick. One of the benefits of recording your own lectures is you get to learn what all of your little ticks are. The first couple of times I did it, I realized that I touched my face a lot. I didn't actually have to record my lecture. The first time anybody ever observed my teaching, the first thing they said afterwards was you touch your face a lot when you talk. And I'm like, that's true. The other one I found out was that I do this. I used to do this a lot with markers or chalk, and because I have a wedding ring on, it makes a noise right next to the microphone, which is hella loud. So I cut that out really fast. So now, thanks, Corbin. Now I'm in my own head about this business. Life, liberty, and property. We mentioned, and I said we kind of addressed these in a rushed fashion. The discussion about life is taken up in Chapter 3 in the discussion of war. The subject of liberty is taken up in Chapter 4 when we're talking about slavery. And Chapter 5 is where we get a discussion of property and property, right? We don't get some kind of other concept that's paired with it. War is the state where your life is threatened, right? So this right to life is going to be the sort of thing that pops up in a state of war. Slavery is the sort of thing that deprives you of your right to liberty. And I guess theft is the sort of thing that deprives you of your right to property. Let's start with life and liberty here, because Locke has some really interesting things to say about these. For example, he notes that both of these two things are inalienable in some way, which is to say, you can't willingly give up your right to life. You can't willingly give up your right to liberty. Did we talk about this at all in our last meeting? That you can't submit yourself to slavery. It's just a sort of thing that you can't legitimately submit yourself to slavery. And I think what goes along with that too is you can't legitimately at least take your own life. So suicide would presumably be off limits. Now there's a little proviso that we get in this that we discussed at our last meeting, which is you can lay down these sorts of things. You can give up a right to life, liberty, or property in exchange for something more valuable. So perhaps we can talk about ways in which you might sacrifice your life for something bigger or better than your life. I don't know if we could say that you could sacrifice your liberty for something more valuable than your liberty. Locke is a little bit slippery on this topic, but he's saying something really interesting here. Yeah, you couldn't for no reason, or you couldn't for something lesser, at least, right? So you can't submit yourself to slavery. Somebody remind me, why not? Slavery is unwilling, so I can't willingly submit myself to slavery. There's maybe a little paradox there. But what if I make a decision like today to willingly submit myself to slavery, and once having made that decision, my past self sets the rules for like my future self, and I'm not allowed to change my mind now. I've made a promise, for example. Yeah. Still can't do it? Yeah, perhaps something like that. Yeah. Or at least as long as I continue to willingly be under the power of somebody else's command, it's not really slavery because it's of my own free will. But then one day, what if I change my mind? I'm like, I don't want this anymore, and my owner then says, like, too bad, you're my property. And that's slavery.
Did you bring up the point that it's a contract that can't be enforced because it's a dumb contract, because it's a one-sided contract?
It's a kind of almost like a self-undermining contract, right? What makes the contract valid is that I entered into it of my own free will. But here I am expressing now that I can't of my own free will give up my own free will. That if I changed my mind, the contract is no longer binding. Does this work for all contracts, by the way? I can change my mind after making them and say my will is, it blows with the wind. So earlier I said I'd mow your lawn for the $20, and now I've got the $20, but I've changed my mind. Oh, maybe I could give you the $20 back and say deal's off. Yeah, Charles.
For something like trading money or something, property might have been exchanged at the time of the deal, but for something like consent is always a matter of the present. You can't take your consent, sign away your consent, and then later say, I've changed my mind. Be like, no, you're still consenting, even though.
Right, so as soon as I change my mind, I guess the contract is null and void. Maybe this is, if I decide to nullify a contract before it's completed, I can do that, but we have to do a proper exchange of everything, right?
How would you return your labor to him? Would he become your slave for the time that you were a slave?
Yeah, that seems like a difficult thing to manage. So yeah, maybe not. This is a bit confusing. This is murky, for sure. Locke does seem to say that these are inalienable, or at least not in any way that can be enforced, not in any way that. Maybe we can even direct us back to this kind of don't harm yourself or others with respect to life, liberty, or property. That is the law of nature. So if you do harm yourself with respect to life, liberty, or property, you're violating the law of nature, just like you would be violating the law of nature if you harmed somebody else with respect to life, liberty, or property. Perhaps not a valid contract because it goes against the law of nature. Not an enforceable contract because it goes against the law of nature. It's an unjust contract. These two seem to be inalienable, with perhaps some exceptions where I might sacrifice my life or my liberty for something greater, to save more people, for example. I can throw myself on a grenade for the sake of my fellow soldiers or something like that. I can take a bullet for my child. Maybe these things aren't completely crazy, but I can't just kill myself, at least not legitimately. I mean, it's metaphysically possible. People do it all the time, sadly. And perhaps in some circumstances, not so sadly. But these seem to be special, even though, and I was articulating this at our last meeting, that all three of these seem to be tangled up in one another, such that we might even think of them as not necessarily separate, maybe as kind of part and parcel of one another. And one of the hints, one of the clues that we get on this is Locke's discussion of when we're allowed to use lethal force in order to enforce the laws of nature. And perhaps if somebody's threatening your life, you can use lethal force in order to prevent them from threatening your life. If somebody is threatening your liberty, can you use lethal force as well? This is how that kind of, the connection, this weaving of these three concepts all kind of begins. Locke says, if somebody is threatening your life, you can use deadly force in order to stop them. You can take their life to save your life. And most of us are like, yeah, sure, that sounds about right. That's just a basic principle of self-defense. But you can kill somebody who tries to enslave you? That doesn't exactly seem like eye for an eye, even. perhaps a bit excessive.
Or if you think about it as if someone trying to capture you, make you their slave, they kind of look like taking your life away.
Yeah, explain this. So it's not immediately apparent how Locke is going to explain this, but he does offer some explanation, and he goes kind of in the direction that you're suggesting here, Ryan. So yeah, keep going with that.
Sort of, I guess I'm thinking about it sort of like if you get sentenced to a life sentence, you're basically forced to give up your life outside of prison. Your family or anything else you would have or could have done.
So if somebody enslaves you, they essentially take your life away from you. It's not your life anymore. It's their life.
It's their property.
I'm their property. My life is their property. This is interesting, yeah. But if this is true, then perhaps there would be no difference. I'm glad you went straight to life imprisonment. Because doesn't there seem to be some sort of meaningful distinction between life imprisonment and execution?
You suffer way longer than you don't die.
Maybe. I don't know. You might be able to make a go of it in prison for the rest of your life. You have lots of time to read Locke. Yeah, Corbin?
Yeah, I was going to say you'd still be a philosopher if you're a slave. Maybe couldn't write.
There have been some slave philosophers throughout the history of philosophy. Yeah, Epictetus was totally a slave and a philosopher. Although, he did most of his philosophy after he, stopped being a slave anymore. Yeah.
Doesn't that imply that your master can both your life and your liberty because he can tell you what to do? So if he doesn't like you being a philosopher, then you're not a philosopher anymore.
Yeah, perhaps. Although I don't know. Yeah, this is liberty with respect to when somebody enslaves somebody, are they able to control my thoughts? They can control my body, I suppose. Maybe bodies are all there are.
Not necessarily. They can threaten you, and that can coerce you one way or the other. But in the end, I believe anyway, you still have free will. You can accept what's going to happen.
Yeah. Locke's gonna. Do we remember what Locke had to say about free will, by the way?
That it doesn't really exist.
Yeah, that it's a nonsense concept. He says that there's freedom, but not free will. Freedom is you get to have your will satisfied, right? Whatever it is that you want to do, that's what happened, and you're like, whoo, I was free then. When what you want to do doesn't happen, you're like, I was constrained. This was contrary to my freedom. But yeah, maybe there is something to this, such that I don't know that I would say that if somebody takes my liberty, they have taken my life. There's something going on here, though, right? They've taken it away from me, so I don't have it anymore. Bennett identifies that there are a couple of places where Locke uses the word possessions. And in those places, Bennett says, when Locke says possessions, he means all three of these. He means life, liberty, and property, not just property. So liberty is maybe a way of talking about how my life is mine. Locke also goes into a discussion about how if somebody will enslave you, I have every reason to suspect that they would try to kill me as well. So my life is in fact threatened. When somebody threatens my liberty, they are in fact threatening my life. When somebody takes my property, are they threatening my life? There's a kind of a slippery kind of quasi-identity going on here. Let's start with, if somebody takes my property, are they taking my liberty? What is property again? Did we go through what property is? Locke doesn't really define it so much as he explains where it comes from. If we were going to define it, we might say something like property is just what mine means. Yeah. It starts with, how does this start? It starts sort of with a kind of an odd sort of a theological premise. It starts with...
He talks about picking up acorns.
Yeah, that's where it gets eventually. But how does it start? Theological... I'll start you off with the theological part. There is a divine... Close, yeah, something like that. A divine gift that Locke talks about. Says there's a divine gift of all of the natural resources of the earth for humans to enjoy. There's a divine gift of the world, I suppose, the world and natural resources for our enjoyment. Yeah. Slow down, bunny. You're hopping too far. Divine gift of the world's natural resources for our enjoyment. Can you enjoy something without having it? This is interesting too, yeah? I've certainly enjoyed a sunset, but I don't know if I had it.
But it was in your view.
It was in my view, I suppose. Let's go back to the acorns, maybe, yeah, or like food. If we're thinking about, like, there's a divine gift of the world's natural resources for my enjoyment. Maybe the first thing that I go to is not sunsets. Maybe the first thing I go to is food. Can I enjoy food? Can I benefit for our enjoyment, for our benefit? Can I benefit from food without having it? Hard to see how, right? Hard to see how I could possibly benefit from food without having it. In order to enjoy it, in order to benefit from it, I need to make it mine. I need to maybe even go farther than make it mine. I need to make it me, right? I take the food, I put it in my mouth, I chew it. It's not just like inside of me, it becomes me, right? I'm like, every single one of us, we're all made of food. First we were made of our mother's food, and then like we started eating our own food, and we became like... So like, yeah, the food that you eat, it becomes you. It does seem like there needs to be some sort of making of something mine in order to benefit from it or enjoy it in the first place. And Locke says, all right, well, insofar as like all of the natural resources were given to us by God for our enjoyment and benefit, we have to be able to make them ours in order to do so. So how does that work? Well, Locke says, I own my body. I own my body? I own my body? Do you own your body? Is your body yours? I just called it your body. Yeah, your body is yours. And maybe this is just another way of thinking about liberty as well. That like liberty is the right to do what I want with my own body. This is the kind of liberty that can be infringed upon, at least. Perhaps like nobody can access the private confines of my own mind. That's a sort of liberty as well, but it's not a sort of liberty that can be infringed upon. My bodily autonomy is the sort of liberty that can be infringed upon. So yeah, I own my own body. And not just that I own my own body, I own my body's activities. This is what it means to have liberty, to own my own body, is that I can do what I want with my own body. So I own my labor. And then that one last little trick that happens is, so when I mixed my labor with the natural resource, when I mix my labor with the land, I make something mine. I own my labor and the fruits of my labor. So, when I mix my labor with the land, I make something mine. In a way that now I have a right to it. It is my property. Yes, Jacob.
Isn't this assuming that coercion is a breach of liberty after all? Because I feel like unless someone's like actually physically taking your body and moving it like a puppet, you're still free to do what you want. It's just there's consequences that come with it.
Actually, I think what you're describing is like the clearest case where I'm not able to do what I want, right? If somebody is physically restraining my body.
Right, but like aside from that, like if someone says like I'm going to kill you if you don't do this.
Yeah, perhaps there's some freedom.
You're still free to do that.
You're still free to take the death instead of like do what they say, except that like life is inalienable.
So is that
like you can only trade up for life. So I guess it depends on like exactly what the deal that the supposed killer is offering me. Yeah.
I feel like you're not.
I'm certainly entitled to fight back.
Within that context, like I feel like nobody outside of physically forcing you to do something can actually force you to do something.
And I think that that's enough for Locke. Locke says, like, if somebody violates your liberty, we're not talking about, like, they offer you bad deals. Although, yeah, do what I say or I'll kill you.
Right. Like
The options that they're offering me are, like, give up your liberty or give up your life. And Locke says, actually, neither one of those is alienable.
Doesn't that break the first rule of nature?
Seems to be the case, right? Unless you're trading for something more valuable. Something more noble is the word that he uses. It seems like Locke would suggest that in the case where somebody gives me an option between like my freedom or my life, I have the freedom to choose, but natural law, which is identical to reason, which is basically, these are dictates of reason. Reason will demand that I decide to put up a fight here. That I'll say, like, no deal. And they're like, okay, so death then. And I'm like, well, you're welcome to try. But now I'm entitled. I have a right to enforce the law of nature and say, you can't take my life or you can't take my liberty. So I can enforce this with deadly force if necessary, right? So that would be the answer, right? If these two are inalienable, and as a matter of fact, if we can think of them as identical with one another, if I'm permitted to use lethal force in order to protect my liberty, because basically somebody taking my liberty is the same as them taking my life, then if somebody offers me this deal of your liberty or your life, I'm not only entitled to kill them, reason demands that I should try. And I should defend myself by any means necessary. So that would be the answer, right? I might lose, in which case perhaps some kind of injustice has happened, but I would have been on the right side of that, and the person who did it to me would have wronged me. Now, all of this is still in the state of nature, right? Hobbes says, like, there is no injustice, there is no injury in the state of nature. But Locke, because he's kind of laid some interesting groundwork here in the beginning, says, like, no, in the state of nature, this is still going to work out. It's not going to say that injustices won't happen in the state of nature. It is, in fact, possible that there will be injustices, and this is a big difference between him and Hobbes. So if I mix my labor with the land, I make something mine. And it seems like I got this idea of like how it is that property rights come about from an articulation of what it means to own my body and to have some sort of liberty over like what my body does. So this is owning my body and owning my labor. So is my property essentially the same as my liberty? And perhaps this is how it is that Locke is able to explain that, at least in the state of nature, if somebody tries to take your property, they may as well be trying to take your liberty, they may as well be trying to take your life, so you can defend your property with lethal force. This is justifiable as well. Except there's one weird thing that breaks this possibility that all three of these are like essentially just articulations of the same idea, and that is that property is totally alienable. I can give up my property to somebody else. I can say, like, this used to be my marker, but Corbin, now it's your marker. Go ahead, you can take it. And now it's yours. No, I'm going to need that back because I only have one black one. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks. So you gave it back to me just now, right? So now it's mine again, right? We can totally alienate property, but not life or liberty. This is a little bit peculiar, a little bit confusing. I'm introducing this. Full disclosure here, I don't know the solution to this puzzle. This is like a weird sort of murky place that Locke goes. Mix my labor with my land, not my land, with the land. It's all of our land. Mix my labor with the land which belongs to all of us, and now something becomes mine. And Locke says this is good. There has to be this property, or at least there has to be this property. It seems like this divine gift implies that we should make property. This is how it is that we create surplus value. Like the world is valuable already. It's there for our enjoyment and our benefit. But I can make the world the sort of thing where that benefit can be realized by making something my property. I mentioned it with food, right? Let's say like I'm walking by, there's an apple tree. It's just an apple tree grown in the wild. It's everybody's apple tree. But I mix my labor with the land. It's not a very exotic or difficult sort of labor here. I just reach up and I pick the apple. And now it's mine, right? The tree's not mine. I didn't mix my labor with the tree. I made the apple somehow better than it was in nature. It used to be on the tree. Now it's in my hand.
So if I broke down a branch, like a rotten branch off the tree,
Then all of the apples on the branch would be yours. And you'd be entitled to eat them now. Yes, Ian.
What about like in the context of like a factory worker, like making something, but he mixes his labor with something. Is his rights being alienated?
So this is so we're kind of jumping ahead now 200 years perhaps to like a post-industrial context where, let me just get a couple more things. I'll come right back to that in just a second because you're kind of anticipating a Marxist critique of like what's going on here. What we're doing here with Locke's theory of property is maybe we're laying the groundwork down for a theory of capitalism such as we're going to see from Adam Smith. 1776 is Wealth of Nations, and it's not till like mid-1800s that we get a critique of that from Marx. And maybe these are like radically different sorts of labor contexts. One is pre-industrial, one is post-industrial. And in the post-industrial one, you have like monopolies on the means of production, and this creates a scenario where like you have workers who are creating value, but they're not enjoying that value. And this is perhaps why that style of capitalism is not self-sustainable, says Marx. I said I was going to get to that. I just did it. Let's kind of like backtrack to like pre-Smithian capitalism and say that like when I pull the apple down, I've somehow improved it. This is going to be like a little more obvious if I till the land and plant some seeds. And before there was just dirt, and now there's an apple tree, right? I not only like mix my labor with the land so that apple tree is mine, but I have improved the land. It used to be the sort of thing that like didn't necessarily offer any food, and now it is offering food. So I do all that, or let's make it simple. I just reach up and I pluck the apple off the tree, and now it's mine. And just as I'm about to eat it, somebody else swoops in and boop, they take it away from me. And I'm like, "Argh." So I reach up and I pull another apple and I go to eat it, and somebody else takes it. And I'm like, "Argh." I reach up and I take another apple, and somebody takes that apple as well. A reasonable person at some point here would probably stop picking the apples, right? Or get a big stick? Yeah. Because you can't actually enjoy it anymore, right? And this is what Locke is saying about property. Like, the ability to make something yours encourages you to improve natural resources, to make them more valuable. Like, there is no reason to labor if you have no expectation of benefiting from that labor. And this is what causes us to make these natural resources more valuable. This is what causes us to be able to, by application of our labor, turn 1 acre into 100 acres, right? We can make things produce more value than they would have naturally. I am actually improving the land with my labor. So there's a kind of an encouragement to work that, as Hobbes pointed out, just kind of makes no sense in the state of nature, if there's no property at least, right? Makes no sense for people to labor and make great things that are going to make life better because anybody else can come and take them from us. Locke is saying, no. Property is the sort of thing that is a natural right that exists in the state of nature and can be enforced in the state of nature. And so even without civil government, we can make the world a more valuable place. We can make it a better place, a more beneficial place, a more enjoyable place. Yeah. And this perhaps could explain, we're 1689 here, so like we're well into the colonization of the Americas. This is part of both an implicit and in other places an explicit justification for why the colonization of the Americas is okay. Because like there were natives there, yeah, I suppose, but they didn't own the land because they hadn't mixed their labor with it. These colonists were going over and they were making the land even better. And so that is what entitled them to go and do it. Yeah. Now, yeah, so like this is a thing, like my property, I don't have to actually have it in my possession at all times, right? So yeah, what if they go into my land and they start improving it? Yeah, but it was mine, so they can't actually work on it without my permission. That seems like one way that we could go around it. And in order to justify colonization, we would have to say something like, the natives were doing nothing with the land, right? They were living off of it, they were enjoying it, but they weren't improving it. They mixed their labor with it insofar as they pulled that fish out of the stream. But the stream is still there and hasn't been improved. They didn't build like a factory on top of the stream. They didn't have a mill that was built. And therefore, they haven't mixed their labor with the land in that way where the stream becomes theirs, right? Or at least that portion of the stream. Yeah. Right, yeah. So this is also maybe in like 1689, nobody imagines we're just like throwing stuff in the river and we're like, where does it go? Like, who knows? Away. Or how could you possibly damage the land so badly that it can't recover? This is not even on anybody's map. Again, we're pre-industrial, right? So we haven't gotten so efficient at intervening on the land that we're perhaps like permanently, or at least for like the foreseeable future, altering it in bad ways. Is there any limit to this property, by the way? Can I just how much labor does it take in order to make something mine? If I go and I look at some land and I'm like, this is mine. Was that enough? If I build a fence around it, is that enough? Now it's mine? Build the fence around it, now the deer can't come in and eat the lettuce or whatever. That's an improvement. If I plant the tree is always mine. If I plant a bunch of trees, all of the trees are mine. You guys catch this? Locke talks directly about this. He talks about, was it with acorns? About so many acorns that you couldn't possibly enjoy them all. And they're all just kind of no. Have you guys ever eaten acorns? No. Me neither. Let's keep it with apples.
Acorns are edible if you boil them.
Yeah, and they're not particularly tasty, though, from what I understand.
I haven't tried it.
No? Have you had them?
When I was little, I used to open them in my yard.
Oh, you just ate them raw.
That's terrible
Yeah.
for your liver.
Yeah, I say, lots of food is bad if you just eat it right off the ground. Yeah, Locke says that. Let's do this with apples. So let's say I plant a whole orchard and there are all these apples, and I've picked the apples, or I picked some of the apples and I'm eating them, and the rest of the apples are just hanging there on the tree. But I'm not eating them. Are they still my apples? And there are hungry people on the other side of the fence. They're like, man, I want some of them apples. And the apples fall off the tree, and they land on the ground. And they're like, you going to do anything with those apples? And I'm like, nah. Just let them rot there on the ground. The whole purpose of this was enjoyment and benefit, right? A divine gift for the sake of enjoyment and benefit. If I'm not enjoying and benefiting from it, then the whole purpose of property, if I'm not actually, I'm improving the land, but in a way that nobody benefits from.
That was one of the questions. Wasn't it one of the quick questions?
Okay, yeah, good. So presumably everybody should have known the answer to this. Then I no longer actually have a legitimate property right to this stuff. If it's more than I can enjoy, then I don't get to make a property claim. And other people can come by and say all right, well, if you're just going to let it rot, then it's mine. This gets a little bit tricky with, what if I say something like, I like the smell of the rotting apples. This could count as enjoyment or benefit, right? Or I'm going to let all the apples rot so that I can make some alcoholic cider. And they're like, but we're hungry. We want to eat the apples. And I'm like, yeah, but I want to get a little liquored up. Maybe this is enough, right? Maybe, because it seems like the exception that Locke is building into this to say that, you can't have so much property, more property than you could possibly enjoy. This requires that I'm not enjoying or benefiting from it at all. If I can benefit from even a little bit, if I'm just saying I like to watch the apples rot, maybe this is going to count as yeah, sure, well, you put the work in. They're your apples. May as well, despite the fact that people are starving on the other side of the fence. This might not be a very admirable thing, but it is not contrary to a property right. Right? There's no limitation to property there. Yes?
So this isn't future focused at all, where you can say, well, I'm going to save the apples, so later I'm not one of you starving to death.
So you could totally do this. Yeah, you could say, I'm going to save the apples, but I would have to be able to enjoy them at a later date, right? If it's more than I could possibly enjoy, if they are in fact rotting in the fields, and I can't make a plausible claim that, no, I benefit from and enjoy the rotting apples, then Locke says, yeah, you have no legitimate property claim there. Other folks can come and eat your apples. Yes?
If you're considered a benefit, if I enjoy to want these apples and not being able to eat them, would that be violating somebody's right?
I don't know that they have a right to my apples. They have a right to life, though, maybe. So this is where it might get complicated, for sure. None of this really seems to matter, because it's almost like an academic exercise of what are the limits to property? You're well, if it's more than you could possibly enjoy or benefit from, then you don't have a legitimate property claim there. All of this just becomes an academic exercise as soon as money comes on the scene. And Locke points out that as soon as we can talk about money, notice that the cool thing about money is that it doesn't spoil. So I can sell those apples and make a whole bunch of money. And people are like, what are you going to do with all that money? And I'm like, nothing now, but maybe later. Maybe later I'll do something. Or maybe we might get into this kind of absurd sort of thing. Like I like watching the apples rot. I might say I kind of have a kind of Scrooge McDuck sort of enjoyment of my money. I swim around in my money bin. I just like to look at it. I stuff my mattress with it. Like I don't spend it on anything, but I still somehow enjoy it.
Or you enjoy the fact that you have it on future generations.
Yeah, or I intend to pass it on to my children or something like this. As soon as we have a currency of value that doesn't spoil, that whole business about like more than you can enjoy before it's like not enjoyable anymore just kind of goes away. Maybe this does open us up to some of the excesses of property rights as Locke has described them. Yeah, Shai.
At the time that Locke was writing this, did he have the whole concept of money in mind? Or is this like a process of living?
He mentions money in chapter 5, I believe. He does, like I'm not just making this up, am I? Yeah, he does mention it. So yeah, he explicitly has money in mind. This is like immediately on the heels of that limitation of property rights where he says if it's more than you can enjoy or benefit from, then you don't have a legitimate claim. Then he immediately follows that with like, but if there's money, this is completely different. And like money is not a brand new invention. Like Oklahoma didn't exist in 1689, but money totally did. It had existed for a long, long time. Yeah. Do we get a sense of how it is that these three things are like intertwined with one another? But perhaps in a slightly puzzling way. The big puzzle for me, at least, is like these two are not alienable and this one is. That's strange. And I can see the connection of how like property is basically an extension of liberty, and maybe this explains how like if I could defend my liberty with deadly force, then I can defend my property with deadly force. And I can maybe kind of understand how if somebody will take my liberty, they'll probably take my life. But now I'm kind of like back to this question of if somebody takes my property, does that mean they're threatening my life? If it's the apples that I need to eat in order to survive, then maybe. If it's my money that I need to buy apples so that I could survive, yeah, then maybe. But there does seem to be something intuitively excessive about killing somebody for taking your property. If somebody's in the process of trying to take your property, to say like, I will shoot you and kill you, and I'm within my rights to do so. Yeah, at least in the state of nature. Maybe this is also we're kind of like, we thought that Locke was like way sunnier than he was. He was like, there can be peaceful coexistence in the state of nature. Yeah, there can, but you can still kill somebody for taking your property. Civil society might be different. We might make laws that say like, nope. Although Locke is going to end up saying that like, if you're in a situation where like there's no opportunity for government to intervene and enforce the laws. Like if somebody is trying to kill you right now and you're like, you called the cops and they're like, we'll be there in 5 minutes. And you're like, in 5 minutes, I'm going to be dead. Then Locke says, all right, then it's war. It's a state of war between you and your aggressor. And you are within your rights to subdue them by any means necessary. Yeah, Ryan.
So I think you can kill somebody for taking your property.
You do? Okay, yeah.
You have just enough property to keep you alive.
Yeah, so if I'm on the brink of like the edge of survival.
And someone comes and takes your apple.
Yeah.
It's your life or theirs.
And for that matter, if we kind of even lean just a little more Hobbesian in our state of nature than like the way that I've been depicting Locke, and I'm not sure, like maybe I am depicting Locke as a little too sunny here, then there might be this, remember Hobbes said like, it's not just enough to survive now because somebody might come and take my stuff tomorrow, right? And if somebody's trying to take my stuff now, who's to say they won't come by and take my stuff tomorrow as well? And if I need that property in order to survive, and at the very least food seems to be a kind of property that I need in order to survive, then if anybody will take any of my property, they may as well take all of my property, and they may as well be threatening my life.
And I think property can be alienable. Like say when you're younger, you can work more land, you need more food and whatnot to survive. But as you get older, it becomes more than you can work. So since you're not working all the land, you've alienated that part of the land, and then somebody else can come in and work it.
You can give the property over to somebody else and say, now you work?
Or if you just aren't able to work all anymore.
Right. It might still, in fact, be your property. Now we're starting to get into like more industrial sorts of models where I say, it's my property, but you can come in and work on it, and in exchange, I'll let you keep some of the stuff that's produced. Some of the stuff that's produced, because it's still my land, so I get to say like what's produced on this land. But now we're starting to get into like the sort of model that Marx is going to critique in about 200 years. All right. A little behind schedule, but good enough to move on. So, next topic. Parental power in conjugal society. It's a bit of a rough transition from Chapter 5 to Chapter 6, but it's perhaps an important one, because now Locke starts turning his attention away from the state of nature and towards civil society. And he brings up this question of parental power in conjugal society because he's entertaining the prospect that maybe this is a model for civil society. In fact, he's not just like kind of pulling this out of thin air. This is a model that is in fact being floated by many folks. They are suggesting that civil society is like conjugal society. Political power in civil society is like parental power, and perhaps this justifies why we have a king who acts like a parent to all of their subjects, right? So if we can model civil society on the parental power in conjugal society, then maybe we have some idea of what civil society should look like. What does Locke have to say about this prospective analogy? I think this was a quiz question too, right? No. It was? It was. Yeah, but his answer is no. Yeah. Yes, it was a quiz question. No, this is not a good model according to Locke. Why not? Where does parental power come from? Parents get to tell their kids what to do. This is kind of parental power, right? It's like this, right? Parents and children are like not at the same level. Parents get to tell children what to do, and children ought to obey. Why? Not quite. Yeah, it's not I brought you into this world so I can take you out. It's a horrible thing to say to your children, by the way. Please never say that to your children. And if your parents do say this, like check in with them, make sure they're joking. So why? What justifies this? Yeah, Sarah.
They're too young to make their own decisions.
They're too young to make their own decisions. Yeah, they cannot make decisions for themselves. They are not capable. They don't have fully developed rationality, so they don't even understand the laws of nature just yet. They can't control themselves. They can't govern themselves, so somebody else has to govern them for them. Right. Some kind of surrogate authority needs to step in. And this is what the parents are. Locke does a kind of like an interesting little move here at the beginning of this section where he says paternal power. I wrote parental power here. Locke talks about paternal power. Let's go ahead and say exactly what it is that Locke means. But then immediately he says, like, they call this paternal power, but really it should be parental power, because aren't there two parents? Am I right, ladies? Like, it's not just like the paterfamilias that gets to like tell the kids what to do. The mom also gets to tell kids what to do. But then he like turns right back around and he keeps calling it paternal power for like the whole rest of the section. And in fact, later on when he says, what if the mother and the father in conjugal society disagree about what ought to be done in the household? Locke says, you guys catch this one? Yeah, knife fight. No, he says, well, then the man gets to decide what to do because he's like more able to like make those sorts of decisions. Way to go, Locke. He gets so close sometimes, and then just completely blows it. But he's not alone in this, by the way. Like he makes a really strong criticism of slavery here, but we know it's going to be considerably later than 1689 before, like, even in Great Britain, they start seriously considering. There are rumblings of an abolitionist movement in the late 1600s in England, but it doesn't really get going until much, much later. I think it's like the early 1800s before it actually gets executed in Great Britain, and it's not until the 1860s that we figure this out in America, and then it's not until like the early 20th century that we figure out that like, hey, maybe women should vote too. They're like legitimate members of civil society. So there's like all kinds of, this is going to be something that we'll come back to when we read Mary Wollstonecraft, and we'll be asking these questions of like, they had all the ingredients for like a real egalitarian society. Why did it take more than 200 years to figure out how to apply it? But leaving those questions behind, paternal power seems to be justified by this idea that children are not able to make their own decisions. At least in a sort of reliable way, and at least not in any sort of like way that they're going to be led by rationality. Children have passions. Like if you put like a marshmallow on the table and say like, hey, do you want that marshmallow? The kid will like reach out and grab the marshmallow. They might even be able to like restrain themselves and like wait for 5 minutes. Have you guys seen this marshmallow test with the kids? They might even be able to restrain themselves in order to get 2 marshmallows if they're old enough. When they're like younger than about 3 years old, they can't do it. It's adorable to watch the kids who can't do it. Like sometimes the experimenter isn't even out of the room. The kid's just like, oh, and like, stick the marshmallow in the mouth. But I shouldn't be too hard on the kids. Sometimes I'm a one marshmallow kind of guy as well. Children are not able to make their own decisions for now. And this is the rub as far as Locke is concerned. They can't make their own decisions now, but eventually they will become able to make their own decisions. And when that happens, that parental power, the justification for that parental power, or paternal power, evaporates. And the child is able to, like, at approximately the age where you guys are now, right? Where your parents tell you to do stuff and you're like, fuck you, Dad, you can't tell me what to do.
Yeah, right.
And then they're like, I brought you into this world, and I can pick you up, right? Yeah. But when you get big enough that they can't actually kick your ass, maybe.
Maybe.
And again, they might kick your ass, but you'd have right on your side. You'd be able to say, like, there is no legitimate authority over me anymore, no legitimate parental authority over me anymore, because that authority is only justified by the idea that I am not able to make my own decisions when I am undeveloped. And as I become more developed, I am able to make my own decisions for myself. So no, it's no longer legitimate that my parents get to tell me what to do. That's for children. What about idiots? It was children and idiots in the essay, right? These were like folks who don't even understand that that which is and that which is not is not. And this is how we know that there are no innate ideas. Remember that whole argument? What about those with severe cognitive disabilities? Will they eventually get to the point where they can make their own decisions for themselves? Or will they be forever at the level of children, as far as Locke is concerned? Locke says, yeah, they never do kind of get past that, which is an interesting and perhaps disturbing move. Maybe there's something kind of intuitively correct about it, which is to say, folks like that who are not capable of making rational decisions for themselves will always require a caretaker to make decisions for them. And there's something about that seems about right. But when he describes how children like reach the age of majority, or like the capability to make decisions for themselves, they can no longer be held within like the power of their parents in conjugal society. They can then go and make social contracts of their own and enter into political or civil society. And this is going to be the difference, right? Political and civil society deals with adults who are capable of making their own decisions. But if you never get to that point, not only will you always require a caretaker, which doesn't seem that crazy, but you're not actually a member of the society. You might say the same thing about my dog as well, right? My dog like never is able to make rational decisions for itself. And perhaps in that respect, according to Locke, if what's required in order to be a member of a civil society is that I'm capable of making decisions for myself, and the decision that I make for myself is to enter into a social contract with other people, willingly lay down some of my liberty in order to kind of hopefully secure life, liberty, and property in a better way, in a more efficient way. This is kind of what it's going to come down to for Locke. That like civil society looks like it's going to do a better job of securing life, liberty, and property than I would be able to on my own in the state of nature, or even with my friends and family in the state of nature. How did I start that sentence? I don't even know where it was going. The point is, yeah, my dog presumably may never actually be a member of civil society in that case, and perhaps those with severe cognitive disabilities won't as well. Doesn't seem to bother Locke in 1689. I suspect this is the kind of idea that might bother us today. Not so much my dog, although that does bother me a little bit. I think maybe my dog deserves some kind of like canine citizenship. She has a certificate and everything that says she's a canine good citizen. But yeah, the idea that people with severe cognitive disabilities are not actually members of a civil society, this is a little bit disturbing. Children not able to make their own decisions, but it's temporary. So if we want to say that like a monarch or a king or some kind of like leader, whatever the sovereign is in civil society, is to its members as a parent is to a child, right? Is to its citizens as a parent is to a child. Locke is going to caution us to say, like, that metaphor is, like, super loose. Do not take it too literally. And folks have taken it quite literally throughout history. This is exactly how they've thought of, like, where it is that the justification for a king to rule over their subjects comes from. That the subjects aren't capable of making their own decisions for themselves, so the king swoops in and says, like, I'm going to make the decisions for you, as if he was a parent to children. And Locke says, that is not appropriate for fully grown adults who are capable of making decisions for themselves. Yeah.
What about like the Republic, like America, where we had people that kind of do a lot of the for us?
So this might just be a division of labor, right? This might be the sort of thing that like the social contract does identify, that like we have legislators. But and we'll get to this. This is maybe going to get into like why it is that Locke thinks that like democracy is a really good idea. In fact, let's stop. Instead of talking about maybe we'll get to this, let's try to get to it. Political or civil society or government. Hobbes says the purpose of civil society, the purpose of creating the sovereign. What was it again?
To get out of the state of nature.
Yeah, to get out of the state of nature. Locke's going to say roughly the same thing. What is it like? What's the key thing that the sovereign is able to do? Like, how is it that the sovereign's able to get us out of the state? Yeah, the whole purpose is the enforcement of contracts. And Locke seems to be under this impression that, like, we might actually be able to make some sorts of, like, compacts or contracts. We might be able to trust one another in the state of nature, especially insofar as we start thinking about this capacity to enforce the laws of nature in the state of nature, right? We might actually be able to find a way to trust one another in the state of nature without having some kind of external authority, the external authority of government. So it's not the enforcement of contracts for Locke. It's the securing of our big three: life, liberty, and property. This is the whole purpose of civil government. And I can do this in the state of nature. And so this is like a big part of like why it is that Locke thinks that it's legitimate and permissible at times to overthrow a government. I don't need government in order to secure life and property. But it's hard to do it without government. I'm not very good at it. If I have to be judge, jury, and executioner for like every single slight against me, I'm never going to have enough time to pick all the apples that I need to. It's just too much work. If we can divide that labor up, if we can, civil society is good at this, or at least it can be good at this. It's better at this than I am by myself. Why? Locke gives us a whole list of things that make civil society better at securing life, liberty, and property than the state of than like what I can manage by myself in the state of nature. I'll get you started. In a civil society, there are laws beyond these laws of nature, which maybe are never written down anywhere. They're just kind of understood rationally. In civil society, there are all kinds of laws. We can make laws. There is a legislative power to make laws and enforce them, such that everyone knows exactly what the laws are. This is not the case in the state of nature. There's no universal agreement about what the laws are. But in civil society there is. Not universal, or at least universal within the civil society. People who are outside the civil society might not know what our laws are. And if they come wandering in, we might say, like, you don't know the laws. And so if you start breaking our laws, we're at war, and we can kill you. What else? What else makes civil society so much better at securing life, liberty, and property than trying to do it on my own in the state of nature? Yeah.
Joint effort of everybody
Are you guessing or are you remembering this from the text? Are you guessing or are you remembering this from the text? Okay. So say it one more time, because you were close to something and I was, yeah.
It's everybody in the civil society participating because it's their will.
Right, so there's kind of like the combination of everybody's will is somehow like bigger and stronger than just my own, right? So yeah, this is one of the things. It's the third thing. I'm going to leave some space in between. There's kind of a, how do I say this? There's an improved power to enforce the laws and punish those who break them. Yep. And this works roughly the same way that Hobbes describes, right? We kind of consolidate all of our wills together, make a strong sovereign, and that sovereign's able to, it has not only the right to establish laws that we can all agree upon, but the power to enforce those laws. There's a second thing in that little trio. Making laws, enforcing laws. You guys took civics in high school or something like it, right? Judges. Known, impartial. Judges. The big three. An executive power, a judicial power, a legislative power, a judicial power, and an executive power. Locke actually does he makes a kind of a separation of powers. He doesn't do executive, legislative, judicial. He does executive, legislative, federative. This is like later on in the treatise. But he's kind of collapsing these things together. The federative power that he talks about is the power to represent a civil society with respect to external, like other nations, right? So this would be like able to like make trade deals with other nations and the ability to wage war with other nations, these sorts of things. So like international interactions are what falls under the federative power. We usually collapse that into the executive branch now. It seems also that Locke is perhaps collapsing the judicial because it doesn't get, like a judicial power doesn't get specifically mentioned. Maybe he's collapsing that into like, it's not just punishing the lawbreakers, it's deciding who the lawbreakers are, so maybe these all get mushed together. But here at least, in this discussion of like why it is that civil society is so much better than any of us would be in the state of nature at securing life, liberty, and property, he gives us these three big kind of these capabilities that government has that we all know and love today from our social studies classes. The ability to make laws, the ability to judge impartially, and the ability to enforce and punish those laws. Good luck trying to do these things on your own in the state of nature. You can make all the laws you want, but like nobody's necessarily going to respect them, right? And you can try. There's don't harm yourself or others with respect to life, liberty, or property, and all of those are just kind of rational truths that any thinking person is going to agree to. But something a little bit more specific, like everybody needs to drive on the right side of the road, that's going to be a little bit tougher to just make up all by yourself, right? So the ability to like make and establish laws that like apply to everybody in the society. Can you be your own judge in the state of nature? Yeah, you can be your own judge. Are you trustworthy to be your own judge? Nah, you're not impartial in matters that concern your own benefit and harm. So impartial judges are actually important. Can you enforce the laws all on your own in the state of nature? You can try. You'll have right on your side, but you might not necessarily have might on your side. Civil society will have both might and right on their side. So long as it works well, right? So long as we're actually satisfying this goal of securing life, liberty, and property for everybody in the society. The whole way that this works is roughly the same way that Hobbes cashes it out. He says, everybody lays down some of their liberty in order to get something better in return. We lay down our ability to do whatever we want partially, Locke says. You give up. It's not like everything is controlled by the government. Some things are controlled by the government. So you partially give up your liberty, and you completely give up your ability to punish others. This is a huge deal for Locke. Locke says the ability to punish others, which is your right in the state of nature, is the sort of thing that you give up in civil society. The government now is responsible for punishing wrongdoers, except in those cases where the threat is imminent and the government can't get there to help you. Then you're in a state of war and you're back into the state of nature and like you're fighting it out with somebody, right? We didn't really get into why it is that Locke prefers democracy over monarchy. Let me do that really, really fast. Here it is. Absolute monarchy, as far as Locke is concerned, it's not just that there's no checks and balances. Well, yeah, maybe it is just that there's no checks and balances. If there are no checks and balances, if the king has absolute authority over me, I'm a slave. Exactly. If the king has absolute authority over me, if the king can kill and imprison me, regardless of whether or not it's just, if the king can say, like, hell with your life, liberty, and property, I'm taking your life, liberty, and property for my own, then I am in the state of nature. Hobbes says that a monarchy is better at doing what the sovereign needs to do than a democracy is. So he's kind of like, yeah, monarchy, pretty good. Like, democracy, if you need to, I suppose, but it's not as good as the monarchy. Locke goes a little bit stronger on articulating his preference. He says an absolute monarchy cannot be a legitimate civil society. It's just not possible. You could have a king, but not an absolute monarchy. It would have to be some sort of like parliamentary monarchy, like they have in England after the Glorious Revolution. Next meeting, Rousseau, who's French.